Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Brandon Davis, President of the Board of Directors of Social Responsibility Chicago. On behalf of the board and our Director of Strategic Engagements and Communications, Mary Cummins, thank you for joining us and for your continued support. I am pleased to say we are growing in membership, but more important, we are growing in strength and solutions. Last month, during our breakfast program, I announced a new program that focused on unlocking CSR, and we held a program which by all accounts was wildly successful. We're looking to continue the professional development and networking conversations and help unlock the mysteries of CSR. Another program and membership benefit that we've rolled out this year is our crowdsourcing, solution-seeking virtual coffees, designed to be smaller, informal meetings with fellow members, really designed to open dialogue and share ideas. As a member with Social Responsibility Chicago, we invite you to bring a solution-seeking item to our table. Watch your inbox and social posts for upcoming virtual coffees that you might find very resourceful. I'm also excited about our January program, Galas, Volunteering, and Auctions Oh My, Leveraging Resources and Impact in Today's World. We know that many nonprofits have historically relied on engaging philanthropic partners, whether individuals or for-profit entities, through galas, auctions, volunteer days, and other special events. But with COVID canceling, postponing, and radically reshaping most in-person gatherings, many are now beginning to scrutinize these activities more closely. Are we moving past the gala addiction? And if so, what does this revenue stream turn to? Is virtual volunteering here to stay? How can we drive impact and engagement in innovative ways? This will be what we'll talk about during Social Responsibility Chicago's panel of experts in January and what they're going to weigh in on the best use of limited resources and new models for maximizing impact in today's world, both for nonprofits and funders. We're still working through speakers, so if you or someone you know could be a panel participant, please contact Mary Cummins. Today's program, though, coming together to support our students, counteracting the impact of COVID-19 on social emotional learning, is extremely important. The pandemic has and is continuing to affect all of us, and Chicagoland students are certainly no exception. In fact, a recent study from the COVID Collaborative and Social Policy Analytics estimate that 167,082 children in the US lost a parent or are caregiver in the home to COVID-19. This has traumatically interrupted their learning and relationships. During this morning's session, Kristen Zemke with Big Shoulders Fund is going to lead our panel discussion as we learn more about social emotional learning and what solutions across sectors are emerging to ensure that our children are healthy, resilient, and supported. Please join me in welcoming our moderator in chief, Kristen, and thank you all to our panel and all of you for joining in today. Kristen, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Brandon. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this important conversation. My name is Kristen Zemke, and I work with the Big Shoulders Fund and schools and conference organizations around the world to think about what's next in teaching and learning. For the past several years prior to COVID, I've had a focus in social emotional learning and really thinking about all the wraparound supports our students need to not only be successful in their school career, but also in life. And so today we're going to take a closer look at this piece of social and emotional learning. And we have a great panel to bring before you today. We're going to focus our conversation just discussing a little broad background on what is social and emotional learning. Then we're going to focus on what it looks like in schools currently, and then really think about how does this play out in the workplace and why does this matter to those of us that work in fields beyond the education sector. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today. I would like to invite Michelle Jackson from Chicago Public Schools to please join us, Melissa Mister from After School Matters, and Laura Frevaletti from the Allstate Foundation. Thank you, everyone, for joining this important conversation today. I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourselves. And Laura, can you please get us started?
Yes, good morning, Kristen, and everyone sharing this time with us this morning. I'm Laura Frevaletti, a Senior Program Officer with the Allstate Foundation. The Allstate Foundation social impact areas include youth empowerment with a focus on social and emotional learning and service learning. That includes inclusive leadership training and anti-bias for youth as well as adults. Our domestic violence focus is on financial literacy as well as healthy relationship education for young people and adults, and a new focus on racial equity. And I'm thrilled to join everyone today and always humbled by my fellow panelists.
Thanks so much, Laura. Melissa, can you introduce yourself for us?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Mister, and I am the program officer at After School Matters. And before joining ASM, I was a CPS teacher and a principal. So all of this is near and dear to my heart from every angle. If you're not familiar with After School Matters, we provide after school and summer programs to Chicago teens, and teens earn a stipend for their participation in our programs. And we offer programs in a very wide range of content areas, everything from visual to performing arts to culinary to mentoring through sports to coding, healthcare, video production, just everything you could think of. And the teens in our programs are attracted to the content area choices, and they get to choose to develop those skills. But the social emotional learning part of it is the core of all of our programs, so that no matter what the content area, we focus on growing 21st century skills. So we really appreciate the invite to be on this panel. This is what I love and this is what we do. And so thanks so much for having me today.
Thanks, Melissa. And Michelle, can you please take a round and introduce yourself?
Good morning. I'm Michelle Jackson from the Office of Social and Emotional Learning at Chicago Public Schools. I manage all of the SEL for every high school in the city, and our department works with all 638 schools within CPS to provide social emotional learning for adults and students. I've been doing this work with our relatively new department. Actually, it's only been in place for maybe the last decade, but we've been doing this work for about 8 years, promoting SEL throughout the district and looking for new ways to drive SEL as a lever for equity throughout the city.
Excellent. Such important work. We are glad that you are here with us today. So if you're new to the acronym of SEL, social emotional learning, right? And when we think about what SEL is, Chicago is so lucky because we have the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning right here. CASEL is their acronym. And I just dropped a link in the chat. What is SEL as defined by CASEL, if you'd like to read a little bit more. But for our working definition, we're going to look towards CASEL, and they define it as the ability to acquire and apply knowledge, skills, attitudes, dispositions for students to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, make responsible decisions, lead with empathy, and to establish and maintain long-term relationships. So lots of those interpersonal pieces. But panelists, would you like to add on at all to that definition of social emotional learning?
Sure. So at ASM, we focus on 21st century learning skills. And so those are life skills, career skills, just habits that are going to set you up for success. And I say you because we focus on teens, but really it's what sets all of us up for success in college and in workforce and generally in life. And we use the MHA Labs Measures of Human Achievement model, and it breaks social emotional learning into building blocks. And they include some of the same things that you mentioned there: personal mindset. So are you able to maintain focus on a task and be resilient? Planning for success. Can you set goals and prioritize? Social awareness. So considering others around you and navigating different contexts and groups of people. Verbal communication, or the ability to communicate and listen and gauge understandings from others. Problem solving, so defining a problem and exploring different solutions and then deciding which one is best to implement. And then collaboration, just your contributions to a team and your encouragement of the team. And again, these are just the same skills that we rely on at work and value in one another every day, no matter what it is that we're doing.
And I would add to what Melissa has shared that the World Economic Forum indicates that 6 of the top 10 success factors for individuals in the workplace are SEL related. So another proof point of just how important that is, not only for our youth through academic success, but continuing then on into the workplace.
Within CPS, we've had to counter this idea that SEL is just a few soft skills that students may need. It really is for adults and students. It is not something that you can have too much of. So I always tell people SEL is not dessert. It's not an add-on. It's not something that we do after or in isolation. It works best when it's integrated into core instruction. And these are hard skills that we must use as tools for driving identity, belonging, and liberatory thinking for students and adults. And when I talk about adults, I really mean the process of staff, teachers, administrators, learning how to examine, cultivate, coach, model, and teach SEL in order for it to truly be effective.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point to note. It's not just something that we teach students. At Big Shoulders Fund, we refer to it as social emotional exploration because it's something you're constantly learning about, whether you're 4 or you're 40 or 75, you're growing and changing and really understanding your relationships and how to interact with the world as every day passes. So hopefully for friends that are attending right now, you can take away some things to be reflective upon and think about moving forward. Another big point to note that Laura made me think of was when we look at the investment behind social and emotional learning, we see an 11-to-1 outcome. For every dollar spent, we save $11 down the road of either, more intensive counseling services, interventions with students. And so, whereas, we were focusing on maybe with our panelists at the more high school level today, we really recognize that this is something we are teaching from age 3 and giving kids the language and the opportunity to explore these emotions, to become not just good students, but productive citizens in the global community. So with that, let's get into our conversation. Michelle, I'm going to start off with you. Why is SEL so important to the success of students?
That was a great segue. I think all of the points that you made prove that. But I think it's really important to students because when it's taught effectively by adults who are able to do the things that I listed earlier, and who are really able or capable to embody the tenets of self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, and last but definitely not least, the greatest of these, relationship skills. SEL can really provide a space for students to authentically and safely embrace their identity as well as the identities of others and take responsible, empathetic risks, and co-construct their learning in ways that are new to many students. They can become active participants in their own learning and really drive what education could and should look like.
Such a great answer. And I do see it like it's that confluence of empowerment, right? We empower students by giving them all the tools, both information-based and relationship-based, compiled so that they can be as effective and advocates for their own learning, their own careers, and their own curiosities moving forward. I can speak to what it looks like in our Big Shoulders schools, and our director of social emotional learning has crafted a daily program for students where classrooms engage in 10 to 12 minutes of a conversation based on CASTLE's 5 core competencies. And when we think about those core competencies, for us, it's those pieces of self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And each day of the week is a different competency. Students and teachers teachers engage in some type of digital media analysis, whether it be a book read aloud on YouTube or a short video segment or unpacking an infographic. So we're able to integrate some of the 21st century skills kids need, and then they have a conversation based in the competency. So what we found is it's that ongoing and consistent support of students to develop the language. We know it's not a one and done. You can't teach one lesson on responsible decision making and expect mastery, but it's the recursiveness of every day of the week. We're going back to these big ideas. And so it's a way to support not only students, but teachers in the reflective process of, am I, being self-aware, is this about me? Is this about students? Is this about the week before winter break? All of those things that can really get us to start having these conversations and then embed us in that overall mindset of this is who we are, even if we're not watching, right? But Melissa, so much of your work is beyond the school day. So can you talk a little bit about what this might look like at After School Matters?
Sure, and I totally agree with what you're saying about equipping young people with the language and making it explicit, because I think that's really important. So in After School Matters, you've got teens in all these different content area programs, again, visual arts, STEM, communications, leadership, all these different topics, right? All the programs have certain things in common though. So all of the programs are hands-on, project-based. All of the instructors receive extensive professional development on how to integrate 21st century skills and how to provide teens opportunities to practice and reflect on those skills. So that's high priority is placed there. High priority is also placed on teen voice and choice. And then the teens also work toward a culminating project, no matter what the program. So it's a performance or a demonstration of what they've learned. And so an example of how that all comes together is this week is our final week of our fall program session. And I attended a closing for one of our programs. It's called Peacemakers, and it's a civic engagement and leadership program where teens learn to recognize themselves as change makers and develop efforts to make positive impacts on their communities. And there was a group of teens who presented a video game that they had created and helped their peers. The game was designed to help their peers navigate negative feelings and avoid violence and seek support, but it was all in the form of video game. So it was really creative and awesome, but sitting there watching them present this game that they created, it was so clear they were demonstrating their sharpened skills at planning, at collaborating as a group to come to this decision to make this game, communicating that out to an audience. And those pieces fit together. The project-based, the choice, the PD for the instructors, the time to reflect each day on what you did, which social emotional skills you practiced that particular day. And again, it's not for nothing that happens. It requires a ton of training for the instructors. It requires that we use a framework. And it requires that we make room for teens to explicitly reflect, kind of like what you're saying, like put a name to it and talk about what you did today and which of those skills it's linked to, what you did well, what you need to work on. And it really does come together well in the course of the program.
It's so great to hear you talk about that metacognitive piece, right? Like thinking about your thinking, thinking about your actions, because that's where I feel like the true learning often happens, right? It's not about what you did, but it's about like recognizing your growth and planning for next steps. And I'm just excited hearing you talk. We know that engagement is an issue, especially in a COVID world, but how are we engaging kids by giving them these tools and strategies they need to be self-directed, be collaborative, and to be problem solvers. So it's so exciting to hear all of these elements coming together with the work that's happening in After School Matters. Laura, a couple of questions have popped up in the chat already, but this is sort of your area of expertise. Speak to us about what the research is telling us about SEL, and maybe even specifically what it's telling us about SEL in a time of COVID. How is this all impacting academic and social success?
I think we have to start with just looking at what children have lost in this time of the pandemic. Brandon mentioned at the beginning of our program that 167,000 children under 18 have lost a parent or a caregiver. And those that have lost a caregiver are 70% of those are 13 and younger. Non-white children have lost caregiving adults at higher rates than their white peers. And although the loss is concentrated, every single state this loss is represented. So it's truly a devastating time for young children. The pandemic has exacerbated those feelings of isolation, stress, loss, and more among young people. And of course, adults, families, and communities as well. And social and emotional learning offers a very powerful means to support one another during these challenging times. So I would say that our research shows us that it is now more than important than ever to demonstrate empathy and resilience, to build relationships, and to call upon our collective resolve to strengthen schools and communities. So that is a call to action to continue to support SEL everywhere that we find it, in school and after school. I also want to talk just for a moment about how this has affected academic success. We know, again, from research that academic performance in the United States for children has significantly declined throughout the pandemic. Children who require special learning services, those living in poverty, and those speaking English as a second language have lost more from the pandemic's educational changes. For children with attention deficit disorders, and virtual learning is this is a positive note, sometimes advantageous. Math learning scores are more likely to be affected than language, and art scores by the pandemic changes. And the last thing I'll mention is that school meals, access to friends, and organized activities, which are incredibly important to children's development, has also been lost with the closing of in-person school and other challenges through the pandemic.
Lots of staggering information there, so much. We know on a day-to-day level how our lives have been impacted by COVID, but really just thinking of all the waterfall effects, especially for young people, in terms of their support networks, right? We often say with our social emotional learning that there's no substitute for social support. And that has been something that has just been stripped away for all of us as adults, but really for our students, where much of their social support comes from school, but adults in their life. And so as this impacts adults, we can absolutely see the direct correlation to this impacting our students. And so, Michelle, let's take it back to you. People attending this conversation are probably caregivers or possibly parents, aunts, uncles, close friends. How should all of us be interacting with and supporting our young people as we continue on with this pandemic?
We should all be actively listening. Now is the time to really, really listen to students, as they are the experts of their own experiences. And they know what they need from us in order to be supported, in order to thrive. It's such an act of love. We often teach within our department and our Office of Equity the act of constructivist listening, and just listening to allow that other person to be heard without interrupting, without making judgment. And so right now, I feel like we're very much still in a pandemic. And I worry that the promises that many of us made, during shelter in place about how moving forward, we'd want to be better people. And somehow now that we're all together again, we've forgotten listening and that act of love. So I feel like this is the time to really engage our children and all of the other adults who interact with them in really finding out more about our individual children that we care so much about. And so if you haven't always been involved with your child or your nephew or your whoever this is that's important to you in your life, their teachers, their school counselors, and I mean every teacher, every adult that they interact with, this is the time to build those, connections, and continue to drive communication so that we're on the same page and we understand specifically what each of our children need.
So
Can I just add, Kristen, that I think another, because you're absolutely right, Michelle, that the listening is so important. I think also helping young people stay involved. So we hear so often from our teens that it's a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent or a friend who refer them to program or kind of give them a nudge to be a part of a program. And while we all have experienced the same feedback that, teens are more stressed, we do a lot of surveying of young people and they're feeling disconnected from their peers and from their mentors. But then on the flip side, once they participate in programs and reconnect with their mentors and their peers, they're reporting feeling more hopeful, feeling more connected, but they got to get to the program. So I think when a trusted other encourages young people, like, I get it, that things are rough now and you're disconnected in all these ways, really do seize every opportunity to be involved where you can, because it makes a difference. And I can't tell you how encouraging it's been to hear that kids do feel more hopeful after they participate in program. I was visiting a program this summer and they were meeting remotely, so it wasn't ideal, but once a week they were able to come together. And I got there a little early and I was sitting with the young lady and I said, how do you like program? And she said, oh, it's good. And I said, well, how do you like coming to the weekly in-person experience? And she said, oh, it just gives me something to look forward to. And that in itself was enough to be like, all right, that's why we have to do this, because in this time, she needed something to look forward to. She needed some connection. And if that's all it did for her, I think we have done our job in that time.
Thanks so much for adding that on. That's another call to action, right? Like, we all have to be even more involved with young people than we have before. And, our conversation today is sort of focused on SEL in a time of COVID. However, this is something that has been very important and on the front of our brains long before March of 2020. And I think with global connectedness and ease of access to the internet and social relationships, we've really seen this level of stress and anxiety rising among young people, not just teens, but even our elementary students. For Michelle, you said, your department's been around for the last decade, for at least the last decade, and probably even before that. So we are discussing what it's like at this moment in time, but this is something that will not go away when the pandemic ends. And there is absolutely that sense of urgency right now as more students need the support because life has shifted so dramatically. And I think, Laura, thinking about this, not just here in Chicago or here in the United States, but from a global perspective, what is the impact of COVID on SEL internationally? And are other places seeing similar issues?
Unfortunately, yes. And in some cases, to a more severe effect. What we know from global surveys are that young women, younger youth, and youth in lower income countries have been particularly hard hit. The study indicates that hardly, of course, anyone living today has not been affected by this, but that the crisis has served as a magnifying glass, bringing all these underlying issues of young people to the forefront. So a few highlights from the study: young people's human rights are under threat. The strict stay-at-home measures in many countries have had a clear impact on young people access to rights, particularly as freedom of movement has been restricted around the globe. Lack of access to housing is another issue, given that many people were affected economically by the pandemic. The right to leisure, which is important for young people, and that includes meeting up with friends and pursuing sports and cultural interests, has been markedly affected by the pandemic. Nearly 1 in 4 young people report a significant impact on their right to access to information, with misinformation rampant throughout the pandemic and on social media. So it's very, very challenging to overcome that in many communities. And talk about education, the pandemic has created devastating effects on the education and training of young people. Over 70% of youth in this study have been adversely affected by the closing of schools, universities, training centers, with 65% of young people reporting learning loss since the pandemic's onset.
So much to think about. I think it was UNESCO reported that in April of 2020, 1.5 billion learners were out of school. And so when we just think about, the global impact and not only access to information, but access to the opportunity to learn, to eat, to feel safe, to stay connected. We can see very dramatic effects. A lot of the schools that I work with are in Southeast Asia, and it's been very consistent. We're having many of the same issues, whether it be in schools that have a high socioeconomic status or schools that might have more needs. Across the board, it's consistent for learners of all types. And so I think that's absolutely something that we need to be thinking about. And certainly for university systems, certainly for the business community, as in we look at the next decade, how will things change? What skills might we need to supplement for some of those times when students were without the access to all of these important things that we know they need in order to be emotionally effective, cognitively effective, and relationally effective as well. Melissa, you've talked a little bit about workplace transition, but maybe can you talk a little bit about the importance of this social emotional learning and how that matters to the business community?
Yeah, so it's absolutely important to the business community because the skills that we're all talking about, the 21st century skills that I referred to earlier, they're the same skills that we all rely on at work and that we value every day, and they're transferable skills so that no matter what field you're in, you're going to need these skills. And I would even extend that to say no matter what time you're in, so that things could change and evolve, but these are timeless skills that you're going to need from now until forever too. And it's funny, even when we can all relate to this, when we look to evaluate and appraise in our professional lives, we'll likely see these same skills reflected in our appraisal system. So when you look at it like that and you say like, oh, these are the same things that if I have people who I'm having to do evaluations of in the workplace, these are the exact same skills that those appraisal systems are getting at. So why not have our young people really well equipped with them before they enter the workplace? And I think Laura mentioned it earlier that these are the ones that are most important based upon all the research on what's most important coming into the workplace, no matter what you decide to do in the future.
And what I would add to that is that I think many young people would be very surprised to know now that corporations, when they evaluate performance, not only look at business results, but they look at your behavior. And it's really a 50-50 evaluation. So collaboration, communication, development of others, a service, learning mindset and approach to work is incredibly important. And then I would also add that technology changes so quickly, so you can enter the workplace with great technical skills, but with the pace of change, that is something that you can learn and continue to learn, but the social emotional learning, soft skills are things that are core and need to be learned, addressed, strengthened throughout one's lifetime.
Such a great point, Laura. And I think like when we think about whether we're working with young people or whether we're working with adults in the workplace, the most important thing I believe we can do is teach people how to keep learning, right? Like how to learn how to be a learner, whether it be in your emotional capacity or in your cognitive realm as well. So many good thoughts going on right there. We've talked or read the studies about the mass exodus of women in the workplace, right? Women having to manage a whole new way of parenting or taking care of others. We've also looked at the increase of reported stress and anxiety from workers feeling like there is no end to the day anymore because the access of working from home signals that you're always available because you are in a home setting. And there are so many needs that adults have in this area as well too. Michelle, could you maybe speak a little bit to the social emotional challenges that adults are facing right now that all of us need to be aware of?
Absolutely. I've been on the ground in schools this school year in ways that I did not imagine. As a matter of fact, when I hop off of this meeting, I have to jump to a school to provide support today. It's just amazing what's been happening on the ground. And so I can speak to what's happening with adults in schools. And I think we're all struggling with the disconnect that happened in the 18 months in which we engaged in remote learning. I think whether we realized it or not, trusting relationships literally have always been our superpower. And then, without those relationships, adults are experiencing burnout, decreased job satisfaction. I feel like essentially we're losing our love for the craft. But we can get back to it. I feel like we can get back to making the magic that we were making before this pandemic started. But it starts with our own self-work. It takes the examination of oneself and really thinking about what we each bring to our jobs, to the spaces that we enter every day, whether that's a classroom or an office space. We also have the power to cultivate spaces that are therapeutic and culturally dynamic. And so when we get back to the work of doing that, I feel like we can move into this idea that this work is ever important, ever changing and cyclical, and we'll have to engage in it repetitively to really become our best selves. But that examining and cultivating are really the stage that I feel we're in of thinking about what we're bringing with us so that we can support our students, our children, if we're our best selves.
Absolutely. And I think this is a call to action for all of us, right? We can look at staffing issues around the country and the number of people who have just walked away from their jobs and are out of work, but don't feel the need to go back to employment in the same way that they had been previously, to signal to all of us there's a response needed, right? And that we have to address some of these things, or at least provide support so that our employees are actualized and engaged and joyful, right? Because we know that joy is the pathway to success in all areas. And when we can feel joyful and feel supported, then good things come on the coattails of that. Thinking about, and this will be a question just for the whole group, but as we're thinking about social emotional learning in the workplace, social emotional learning in schools, how can companies, corporations, individuals support education or nonprofits in this work, in the work of implementing social and emotional learning? And whoever would like to start with answering that question, please feel free.
I'll just jump in and say I should sit back and listen. as a corporate funder.
Well, so we appreciate Allstate so much for your corporate funding. But I would go back to what Michelle said earlier when she said social emotional skills are not dessert. And I think the more we all have that understanding that they are critical skills that need to be supported, I think that's a big piece of the battle. And, for ASM in particular, over the past decade, we've grown from serving 7,000 teens to 19,000 teens, and we regularly receive twice the number of applications and opportunities that we're able to offer. So really understanding and believing in the need for teaching social emotional skills, the increased support and partnership will help us better meet the demand. So I think that's the main thing. I think the other thing is that we have to remember all the pieces that go into offering programs equitably and removing barriers to teen participation. We need resources to support expanded professional development. So to Michelle's point, we got to support the people who support our teens. If they're not well equipped and healthy and happy and joyous and well compensated and all that good stuff, it's difficult to provide a quality program to young people. And we also need to remember that our stipends mean a lot to teens. And so that maintaining the stipends, increasing the stipends is really important, because that's one way that we make sure that there aren't barriers to teens being able to participate in programs. And we want to be able to reach the young people who need us the most.
I agree with everything Melissa just shared. Right now, CPS has received a windfall of funding through Moving Forward Together. And so we are building out programs for this year and the next year and a half of intensive SEL and mental health supports throughout the district, including behavioral health teams within every school, as well as community partners that push into schools to provide direct counseling, small group interventions, and one-on-one. And so we have a lot of moving pieces happening now, but this is not going to end in a year and a half. Like, we will still need the support of funders who value this work and know how important it is to drive SEL throughout the district. And ultimately, I feel like if we can drive it here in the third largest district in the country, we're really moving SEL for the nation.
I will chime in with a call to action for any funders in the audience that social emotional learning is so important to fund. It may feel squishy at first, but when you read the research, and there's decades of research to show what a traumatic and positive impact this makes on young people's academic, work life, and family and life, it's worth an investment. I would also add that curriculum, as Melissa and Michelle both said, professional development is incredibly important. We fund some wonderful programs through Facing History. How do you lead with equity? Teach through equity in these programs. Look for culturally responsive programs and ways to share the information. So yes, and someone has talked about their favorite phrase here. I have to say, trusting relationships is my favorite superpower that you mentioned. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
Excellent. So much for us to think about. And I know at Big Shoulders Fund, we've had several partnerships with organizations in the community that are supporting this work, whether it be teacher development in this area, or we've just received a grant from Cigna that is helping us put counselors in schools. And parochial schools, counselors are not a regular part of the budget. So to get students in underserved communities access to counselors is huge. So every little bit absolutely makes a difference. It's that time of the morning where we turn it over to questions from the audience. And one question that is leading off my list right here is just, what are some of the challenges to implementing SEL in a program or in a classroom? And I'm not sure who would like to respond to that, but please feel free.
I think one of the challenges that we're experiencing that we've been working on chiseling away at over the past few years is this understanding of SEL as being, again, an add-on or something that we can do as an aside. There's a growth mindset issue that we're tackling in getting people to understand the importance of this work and how it will eventually lead to the outcomes that teachers really do desire. And so we have been working very hard to dismantle some of the beliefs within our district about what this work actually entails and how effective it can be when it's rolled out thoughtfully, when it's rolled out again by adults who have an understanding of themselves and really cooperate in active adult SEL on a daily basis. And so it's working. It's slow progress, but we know that it's worth it. And so we are daily doing the work through our SEL specialists who go out across the district and drive SEL instruction through about 20 different SEL specialists throughout our networks within our schools who are driving this through the network level, coaching principals, coaching teachers, coaching staff members on effective SEL and SEL integration within schools.
Another question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
I'll
Laura.
just add on quickly that one of the things that has been brought to our attention is just access to curriculum and professional development and all those supportive resources that go along with that. And one of the things that the Allstate Foundation has funded is an SEL center through Discovery Education, where the resources are all free. So I'd encourage everyone to access that for free resources.
Such a great resource. Thank you, Laura. Another question in the chat was, can you share an example of how proactive SEL practices have helped get in front of common disciplinary issues in youth? And I'll let you guys think about that for a second. Well, I just share a little bit. I dropped a link earlier to the chat from one of our schools, Visitation Catholic. The Friday Institute at North Carolina State came out and did a case study on the work that they've been doing in social and emotional learning. And I'll drop a video really quickly into the chat that shows a summary of what students have to say about the impact, what teachers have to say about the impact, as well as parents. So after the call, if you want to take a look at that, please feel free to do so. It gives you a real window into what it looks like. But other examples from our panelists, what does it look like in action and how does it help?
So I think one of the examples that comes to mind, and it's funny, we've got a number of these programs, but the Peacemaker program that I mentioned earlier, it's about civic engagement. A lot of what ends up coming out of it, and the teens tend to bring this to the program, is conflict resolution, because violence is an issue in Chicago. And so a lot of times they choose to address violence in their community as what they're going to focus on. And a lot of the feedback that we get, qualitative feedback that we get from the teens in the form of comments on surveys, is that they approach conflict differently as a result of having been in the program. And again, that's invaluable outcomes for us, where they say, I stop and I think about the situation and what I could do differently based upon having had this space to talk through challenges that you might encounter and how to be resilient and that kind of thing. So I think that's the example that comes to mind, as we hear that a lot, particularly from that program, participants in that program.
Such a great example. Michelle, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think about all of the restorative practice work that's happening within our district now, which is under the umbrella or the auspices of SEL. And it really has changed the way that we look at student discipline. This is a tough year because we're coming back together, and without those relationships, it makes it very difficult for us. I keep telling people, because I support high schools, we have really almost an entire school of freshmen this year. And so thinking about it from that vantage point that we need to re-engage everyone, including our adults, but thinking about ways to still be restorative in how we approach discipline, as well as training. We have a whole trauma cadre that's happening. And so we're looking at teen mental health first aid and training students actually on what trauma first aid looks like so that they can inform others and be really the advocates within their buildings to drive the work of mental health first aid as well. We're looking at a number of ways to uplift student voice in ways that haven't been previously tried. And so that's where I really see kind of that restoration that really changes the dynamics of student discipline within a school. And so although we have an uptick right now, I know we're going to go back down because I've seen it happen before. So historically, we will, once we get our magic powers back, I believe that we'll begin to trend towards some more positive rates, especially with the new tools that we're using.
So great to hear about all of the ways that this is having an impact. We're working, actually, Big Shoulders is working with the Kennedy Forum to establish that mental health first aid. And I'll drop a link in the chat in just a second to that, because that's been a very powerful partnership for us. But another question from attendees was, can you measure SEL outcomes, whether in a classroom or in a program? And so I'm going to turn it over to panelists to hear what you think about that.
Yeah. So we definitely measure those outcomes as part of our programmatic outcomes. And what we do is a retrospective post survey. I had to say that correctly, so Arnie didn't say you explained it all wrong. But basically, teens are asked about their skills in these areas at the beginning of the program versus at the end, when they've got an understanding of what they are. And so that growth, their perceived growth of I understand better what this means and I'm better at it based upon my experience in the program is how we measure SEL skills at ASM. And I think also it's a combination of the survey feedback, qualitative feedback, external assessors coming into the spaces and being able to assess. If you put all three of those together, that's how we come up with whether or not what we're doing is effective.
That's awesome. Right now, we're engaging in a number of practices, including SEL skills inventories that are being used directly with teachers and students, as well as at the high school level. We're using something called PERTS, which has been used with U Chicago as a way to measure SEL skills. That survey in particular is done by students, and that data is only teacher facing. It's not admin facing, so that teachers feel safe using it. And students are able to directly express what they are getting out of instruction as it relates to social emotional learning on a daily basis.
It's so important, I think, to have those indicators. Our director of SEL, Kirk Zemke, is working with Dr. Clark McCowan out of Rush University. He is the founder of XSEL Labs, and it is a reference and normed assessment. I'll drop a link to it in the chat that measures beginning, during, and end of year growth and development. And we have just seen tremendous results from the work that's happening. And it's so important, I think, to have those indicators. So we're measuring effectiveness and then engaging in those metacognitive conversations about our practice and what we can do to improve these sorts of things. So many great ideas and conversations taking place here today. I would love to have all of the panelists just take a quick second. If you'd like to drop your contact information or your social media into the chat so people can reach out to you if they have additional questions or want to follow along with the work that you are doing. Michelle Jackson from Chicago Public Schools, SEL, Melissa Mister from After School Matters, and Laura Fravoletti from the Allstate Foundation. I cannot thank you enough for your thoughts, ideas today, but your energy for this work every single day and your advocacy to not only inform us at Social Responsibility Chicago, but to inform others around the world about the desperate need for this type of work and how it truly is a core skill that not only young people, but all of us as adults need to be working on. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you to our attendees. I would love to invite Brandon to come back on and close out our conversation today as we wrap up. So Brandon? Or if Brendan's not available, I can close us out as well. Michelle, Melissa, Laura, final thoughts or last words for the group?
No, just I'll put it in the chat as well, but our website is afterschoolmatters.org and there's lots of information there. And my email is melissa.mister@afterschoolmatters.org. Please do reach out if there's any additional questions.
And I'll just say a thank you. I, like everyone else here, just cannot say strongly enough how important SEL is to all of our futures. The Allstate Foundation, allstatefoundation.org, has resources for both educators and families on SEL, and I encourage everyone to take a look at that. Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to thank you guys for having me today. This has been great. And please feel free to contact me if you'd like more information on what CPS is doing around what Chicago Public Schools is doing to support social and emotional learning. I'll drop our link in the chat as well. Thank you again.
And thank you, Michelle, Melissa, Laura, and Kristen. I was jotting down notes and trying to feverishly finish before you asked me to come back up. I'm so thankful. I'm seeing all of the messages in the chat and everyone is just so appreciative of your time this morning. So thank you all for joining us. Please reach out to these expert individuals who know this space inside and out. Contact Social Responsibility Chicago and Mary Cummins, and we'll be sure to provide as much resource and information as we can. We know there was a ton of resources and information and links in the chat, and we'll be doing our best to get those out to everyone who attended in our broader network of Social Responsibility Chicago members and partners. So thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of the day. Happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.